this session, we will share with you the scope of the research. This is the research on media sustainability and universal access to public interest journalism. And we will unpack the issues and the rationale for a set of recommendations to be considered by the media industry. And we'll also try to get a sense of support for the policy options in this webinar, so that when we take the recommendations to the ethics conference, we have an idea of how participants felt about it. So on the structure of the session today, we will first get an overview of the draft report from the research team, led by Michael Power, together with Avni Singh from Alt Advisory, which is a public interest advisory and research firm focusing on public law, information rights, and other issues. Our panel will then reflect on issues raised in the report from different perspectives. Then we'll give an opportunity to discuss the issues raised in the report. And finally, we will look in more depth to the specific recommendations to get a sense of support for the policy options that we think should be considered by the industry in support of media sustainability. So with that, I would like to introduce the first speaker, Michael Power. So he's a director at Alt Advisory, focusing on public law, information rights and data privacy, emergent technology, and particular interest in the development and implementation of constitutional and international law. So Michael, the floor is yours.
So thank you, Izak, and good morning to all of the participants on the call. We're looking forward to a really useful conversation today. I see my role is providing an overview of the report, and then really using the rest of today's conversation to debate with you effective strategies to ensure media sustainability, and then ultimately recommendations that we want to make going forward. If I could ask colleagues from frayintermedia to share slide 1 of the deck that was prepared. Thank you. So, as a point of departure, I can see Reg Rumney's on the call. I'm not certain if Harry Dugmore is, but extensive research has been done in this field already. So from a South African standpoint, we've leaned heavily on Reg and Harry's work. And then from an international standpoint, you all know that there have been significant developments in this space, particularly through the Australian Senate's research into the future of public interest journalism, and then notably the Cairncross Review, which focused on similar aspects in the United Kingdom. But just as a point of departure, and really looking at where we want to get to, is this first step. And here we note that the French government contributes an estimated 1 billion euros to media sustainability each year. And this includes deviations through indirect subsidies, 200 million euros in exemptions for local business rates, 160 million on lower VAT rates, and around 250 million on special taxes and social security contributions. You'll also note, which will become relevant to our conversation a bit later, but that the government directly contributes a public interest wire service, being the AFP, and that's one of the submissions we will make. And then turn to the next slide, if possible. So just to reaffirm what Izak had introduced, maybe to take you directly to point 2, but the scope and the primary purpose of this research is to respond to recommendation D35 of the independent panel report. And here, for the purposes of understanding the parameters, the panel called on SANEF to support research into the financial viability and sustainability of all forms of news media, examining international approaches to funding independent media, including but not limited to taxation incentives, exemptions, allocation of public funds, the pursuit of royalties, levies on online advertising revenue routed offshore by online platforms, and any other such methods. So if we can then turn the slide, we approach the report in multiple parts. We obviously provide an introductory overview, and then we start with providing, from our standpoint, an overview of the constitutional imperative on the South African government, not only to protect, but also to promote. Thereafter, we break into a debate on definitional terms, and we give an overview of defining public interest journalism, comparative to journalism for the public good, comparative to public service journalism, and ultimately find that, this is a discussion that we need to have further, and it will require us to engage in further policy alternatives. But we seek to locate our work around public interest journalism. And that's something that, particularly when we get to the first of our media sustainability initiatives, being the MSF, or the Media Sustainability Fund, there's a criterion and a need to determine how it is that we want to properly categorize what we mean public interest journalism to be. We then turn to identifying 8 potential categories of sustainability strategies, and we identify around 15 high-level policy positions that may be adopted. So the way in which we've crafted this research is not to provide direct guidance on exactly what should take place, but we have sourced from primarily an international comparative perspective a variety of potential proposals that can be taken forward, developed, and ultimately catered to the South African context to ensure that we can move closer towards media sustainability and access. So if I then take you through each one of the 8 strategies in brief. The first is the Media Sustainability Fund. And this is one of the primary positions taken by SANEF, seconded only by Access to Public Interest News and Websites. The MSF is effectively a multi-source fund that SANEF seeks to establish, whereby the fund itself receiving source government income and income from the private sector, as well as philanthropic organizations, would seek then to complement and support public interest journalism in South Africa. Some of the questions we need to think about in relation to this fund is whether or not the fund provides solely general or core support, meaning support to the operations of newsrooms, or whether it would seek to provide more specific or project-based support. There's also the notion of eligibility around the fund, and there were extensive debates in the drafting process, which included interviews with persons in sort of the public interest media sector, and the determination as to whether or not this fund should rely on mandatory or discretionary criteria. We'll see later when we deal with recommendations that the proposal is that mandatory criteria is preferred to ensure that there isn't any undue influence. We then turn to the question of access to public interest news websites, and here 2 primary policy proposals are made. Harry Dugmore engaged in extensive research complementing popular movements like the R2K at the moment around the notion of data must fall. And we, in the report, suggest that to ensure diversity and particularly access across the urban-rural spectrum, that significant reductions in data costs are necessary. We make policy proposals on that. We then also move to the zero rating of paywalls. And as a secondary objective of SANEF, and sort of one of its 2 primary proposals, we suggest that access to public interest news should be 0 rated. And there, quite an interesting debate occurred between public interest news sort of behind paywalls and that which is more publicly accessible, and how we would draw a distinction between 0 rating of those 2 different types or pieces of content. We then looked at what is probably one of the most contemporary discussions taking place at the moment, but it's fostering competition in the digital economy. And here we leaned extensively on what's happened in the United Kingdom, what's happened in France most recently, and then big developments which took place during the course of this year in Australia, where the Australian Competition Commission, through legislation now, has enacted a mandatory code of conduct for bargaining between the social media platforms and the Australian press. And we made submissions there as to particular approaches and a further market inquiry that the Competition Commission may seek to engage in, where SANEF and partners may make submissions similar to what we've seen transpiring in Australia. We then turn to one of the primary media sustainability mechanisms. That is our fourth sort of general policy proposal, and that's tax relief, which is complemented by our fifth policy proposal, which is subsidies. And here, again, leaning on some of the research by Harry Dugmore, we looked at this notion of converting licensing fees, which has been successfully adopted in Sweden and Norway, and really looking at a more effective way to collect what we currently see as our TV licenses, but possibly converting that into a special tax and relying on the South African Revenue Service to collect. We then reflect on some more contemporary proposals around media sustainability, that being an online ad tax, where the proposal is really the big collectors of revenue through advertising should receive special taxation subject to their income generation, and that would again link with this question of fostering competition or the digital economy in the digital economy, and what we should do about platforms. And then lastly, we touch on various strategies relating to tax relief, both for public interest news organizations and for donors. So here we suggest revisiting value-added tax, as well as pay-as-you-earn taxation from newsrooms, and equally looking at remedying, or at least extending Section 18A of the Income Tax Act to allow for specific deductions to donors who fund media sustainability. We can then turn to the second of the two media sustainability slides. The next four sort of proposed models, well, firstly is subsidies. We provide an extensive overview of the various subsidies which are proposed in comparative jurisdictions. And here we draw out sort of two notable potential policy approaches. The first is developing the concessions model. Currently, there's a concessionary allowance for elder persons in terms of TV licenses, and we suggest that that could be extended to the youth, as well as proposing an access tiering model, where if we accept that paywalls are currently one of the approaches that are being considered by public interest media organizations, and access tiering, whereby discounts are given to different categories of persons to ensure that there's access across the digital divide, is something that may be considered. We then also look at potential new business models, including the so-called medium model that's being rolled out in the United States. Thereafter, there's sort of a novel introduction that we were debating in the research, and that's the introduction of a so-called coupon system. And here simply the idea is that currently you need a username and password to enter each paywall, and there's no sort of pooling of those particular funds. So the proposal here would be that a SANEF or similarly situated organization would enter into agreements with various public interest news media organizations, and they would then allow for access to multiple platforms. And by way of example, a user would pay the so-called SANEF fund, let's say 100 Rand. 25 of that would be immediately taxed to the Media Sustainability Fund to ensure a continuing flow of income and expanded income stream. The other 75% would then go by way of an apportionment of clicks to the most popular sites visited by that particular user. So, that way, one username would get you behind multiple paywalls. This organization would assist public interest media organizations in hopefully generating a high user base, and equally, there would be a tax generated outside of the state to sustain and fund the Media Sustainability Fund. Then in terms of the last two, a really interesting proposal was made as sort of the seventh sustainability strategy that we've identified. But Frances Cairncross refers to the so-called humdrum task of reporting on the daily activities of public institutions. And she sees that alongside investigative reporting as the two primary roles of public interest journalists, but notes quite correctly that the second, this reporting on daily institutions, often doesn't have the requisite support required. So in discussion and in interviews, it was proposed that it may be that the Media Sustainability Fund as one of its loanees, supports the re-establishment or re-emergent SABA that would be solely funded by the MSF, but would ultimately assist with the so-called humdrum task of reporting on daily activities, and ultimately distribute that to multiple public interest news organizations who then may be able to drive additional traffic to their particular sites. And then lastly and importantly, and there's a slight overlap here with a lot of the reporting in the independent panel report, but we focus on the need for fellowships and sort of a re-emergent cadet program where we look at the longer term sustainability of media organizations. And here again, we suggest that the Media Sustainability Fund may fund fellows, both to support with introducing young journalists to the profession, but equally to assist with capacity constraints in newsrooms. We focus on the importance of continuing education for mid-career and senior journalists, and then note the import of media and information literacy initiatives, which is a strong position being taken by the Council of Europe and UNESCO. And we note that this is an instance where direct state funding is necessary and important. So Izak, I hope that I haven't gone over time, but I think that gives a general overview of some of the strategies that we've identified in the report. I appreciate that 15 minutes is simply not long enough to give you an entire overview, but I hope that this at least gives you an understanding of some of our thinking and where the report is at this particular stage. So that, Izak, back to you.
Thanks, Michael. I just want you to pick up on one issue. What is the constitutional and multilateral justification for the state to support media? And would that not be a problematic issue?
So thank you, Izak. So it's certainly an arguable position. I mean, in terms of Section 16 of our Constitution, we have an entrenched right to press freedom. But I think if you look at the way that jurisprudence is developing, and I mean, what we note in the report is the original negotiations around the Constitution in the first instance. But we see press freedom as an instance where there's certainly a positive obligation on the state. At this stage, you know, the state's argument may be that through the SABC and the MDDNA, they are disposing of that particular obligation. But we would suggest that an enabling environment needs to be created for press freedom to flourish within South Africa. And in our view, you know, reading Section 7 with Section 16 of South Africa's Constitution, this notion not only to protect press freedom, but equally to promote and enable is something that we would suggest is something that is arguable, certainly, but something that we could push forward as a position to adopt in policy. You know, if we then look at reading in foreign comparative and international law into that Section 16 provision or the press freedom provision, there's strong arguments to be made, particularly from Europe and through some of UNESCO's reporting, that this positive obligation does in fact reside on the state. And as a result, you know, we could suggest that additional funding to the MSF would be needed for this particular purpose. I think just in adding to that, there's an additional argument to be made that COVID-19 has caused severe complications within the industry. And that would be another hook under which to suggest that this MSF should be established outside of pre-existing mechanisms.
In the research report, you also refer to the African Declaration on Principles of Freedom of Expression and Access to Information, which actually sets out a kind of a framework for how government should support diverse and pluralistic media, right?
So yes, you know, a comprehensive review of the declaration was completed by the African Commission last year. So I think you were quite extensively involved in that process, if I remember correctly. But alongside the African Commission position and sort of the Council of Europe position, you know, these would be considered more sort of soft law instruments. So I think there's two ways to look at this particular debate. We fully support the soft law position that's been developed through the Commission and the Council of Europe. And in terms of the way we would interpret Section 16 of our Constitution, we're more than entitled to rely on soft law instruments. These are not binding or treaty law instruments, but the way that our constitutional jurisprudence has developed is that we equally recognize both. So yes, the import of these instruments would be both from developing policy in South Africa, but equally from a litigation standpoint or developing jurisprudence. So Izak, you're correct. I mean, the baseline for arguing for media sustainability and a promotionary position from the state is certainly there. And I would be surprised in light of the way that our law has developed if this wasn't seen to become a norm in the status quo.
And I just want to stick for a moment to the issue of government support for independent media, because I think it is a very contentious issue. But I want to quote from the World Press Freedom, or the Windhoek Plus 30 declaration that was adopted at the World Media Freedom Conference on Monday this week. And the topic of the World Press Freedom Day and Conference was journalism as a public good. And in the declaration, they noted a number of issues, or made a number of calls to governments, to tech companies, to media organizations. I want to just, in this context, read two of the calls made to government in the declaration. The first one is point 17. Government should take effective steps to nurture a diversity of viable public, private, and community media, and implement specific policies along with relevant safeguards to promote the production of independent quality journalism with the aim of ensuring people's access to relevant, diverse, and reliable information. And clause 18, government should ensure that flows of funding from public sources to the media, including subsidies and advertising, are allocated fairly and overseen in an independent, transparent manner, and guarantee investment in journalism. Now, with that said, I want to turn to the panel with our panelists today, Moshoeshoe Monare, Arena Holdings Managing Director, Nwabisa Makunga, Editor of the Sowetan, and Phathiswa Magopeni, Editor-in-Chief and Group Executive of SABC News and Current Affairs. So we have, as you can see, people on the panel that can speak from a perspective of media management, from an editorial perspective, from a public service perspective. And I want to start with you, Mosh. What is your view about this issue of state support for media? And also, if I may add to that, isn't there a big obligation also on corporate South Africa to support independent media? Over to you.
Thank you very much, Izak. Thanks very much, and good morning. I will touch on those issues in my notes that you just raised now. And thanks for the invitation to this webinar. It's also great to reconnect with my editorial colleagues and friends. And I must commend editors and SANEF in particular for taking the initiative to proactively interrogate the financial sustainability of the media. It's an inevitable and a courageous step to acknowledge that quality journalism can only be sustained by a sound business model and a solid and close relationship with the audience. I wish and hope that the same approach that you are taking here could be adopted and applied in our newsrooms, in which editors work closely with and not rely on the executive and managers to drive the change. Your innovative research projects and reports will have a catalytic effect on the media industry in the country and hopefully in the region and the continent. I'm not here to pretend to have solutions or a magic wand to our challenges and difficulties, but I will comment on some of the issues raised in your report. And at the end, obviously, we'll have interactive discussions and robust exchanges. First, I need to raise my own perennial concerns relating to any debate and discussions about the role and sustainability of the media. My appeal is that in whatever we do, and this will also answer the question that was raised by Izak, in whatever we do, we need to ensure that we take the South African public along with us and not leave them behind. This will lend credibility, support, and legitimacy to our efforts, and cause and preempt and quell any suspicions regarding our motive and intentions. Yours is a public interest noble cause and can only be strengthened by a wider participation by ordinary members of the public. And we need to deliberately and thoroughly answer why is it important for our democracy and the country to have a viable, vigilant, vibrant, and diverse media. We need also to ensure that this is not about the so-called media centricity or exceptionalism. We need to remind the public that we are burdened with multiple and contradictory obligations, the obligations that you just raised, Izak. These obligations range from commercial viability of our businesses and creation of value for the shareholders, which is inevitable if you are if you are running a business. And this will also include to adhering to professional ethics and media standards, and ultimately giving expression to the freedoms and rights contained in the Constitution. I'm encouraged by your report quoting from the Holomisa case, in which the Constitutional Court explained these obligations, responsibilities, and the powers of the media. But we must also remember that the same Constitutional Court in the Mamabolo case reminded us that we as the media, we enjoy no different and superior status in the Constitution, meaning that there are other interests, there are other rights, there are other freedoms in the Constitution which have to be considered and are competing with the freedom of expression in the media. Unlike the American system, ours doesn't have a hierarchy of rights, but all the rights have to compete on equal footing. And that we must not have any illusions of exceptionalism or false sense of power. But if we succeed in embracing and involving members of the public, which is very important in our course, then we can trigger and invoke Article 14 of the Declaration of Principles on Freedom of Expression and Access to Information in Africa. It calls for, I quote, "State to promote a conducive economic environment in which all media can flourish, including adoption of policies for provision of financial and other support for the sustainability of all media with transparent and accountable allocation of funds for public advertising and effective measure to avoid undue concentration of the media ownership." However, if we do not try harder to get the broader public on our side, we will be seen as an elitist grouping whose only concern is just to create value for our shareholders and just to protect our profession. We need to emphasize the broader role of the media beyond mere commercial interest. Should the public think, for once, that we do not act in their interest, in their best interest, as required by the Constitution and our ethical obligations, they will ask these questions. They will ask, why must anyone care about the decline of the media? What about other industries facing similar decline? Why must we use taxpayers' money in the form of subsidies, incentives, and tax reliefs to sustain commercial media enterprises? These are the questions that they will ask if we don't take them along with us. To win the public support, sympathy, and solidarity, we also need to ensure that our content is relevant and reflect the diversity and pluralism of the South African society. Because if you look at our coverage and also our reach, except for radio and to the extent TV, only less than 5 million South Africans can consider themselves as regular newspaper buyers. And most of this audience is mainly in urban metros and of a particular income bracket. And this criticism, colleagues, obviously goes to all of us. It's not about pointing fingers. It's about all of us in this industry that we need to take that responsibility. We need to ask ourselves these questions. In your report, you also said, I quote, "A reflection is needed within the news business of whether journalism is offering what the audience wants and needs." The independent panel report also pointed out that, I quote, "Transformation of the South African media has been haphazard and incomplete, that the nation's majority population remains severely unrepresented in the media ownership and control." So this is the question. I'm sorry. This is the question that will be asked when we go out there to say we need some subsidy. We need some subsidy to sustain the media. So it's a question that we need to really be mindful. We need to be prepared to answer. Therefore, we need to be mindful that these sensitive but pertinent issues will be raised when we consider any state or corporate support to sustain the media. Unless we are relevant, our legitimacy is at stake. Along with the questions of legitimacy comes the question of credibility and public trust. It's unfortunate that one of the biggest media groupings, one of the biggest media groups has withdrawn from the Press Council and other industry-related bodies, because this will also make members of the public and other stakeholders to say, but how can we trust in you? How can we trust in you as an institution, as a profession, as an industry, if you cannot adhere to your own ethical institutional obligations? The fractures and petty squabbles within the industry are impacting negatively on our credibility and eroding that public trust. Without unity of purpose, we are digging our own grave. Luckily, SANEF has acknowledged in the report that the trust deficit, and it has acknowledged that that there is the trust deficit, and recommended collaboration with like-minded organizations to rebuild public trust in the media. This calls, therefore, for a higher sense of accountability, humility, and treating the public with utmost respect, while checking the exercise and abuse of public power. With our investigative exposés and hard-hitting front pages, we must always remind the public that this is about their right to know, to receive or impart information, and not just writing these stories for professional rewards and awards. With local government elections coming soon, we need to enhance our role in deepening participatory democracy and ensuring that citizens make informed decisions. This demands a closer relationship with the audience, whether in a form of a strong customer care systems or audience feedback. It demands of us to listen attentively, unassumingly, and not arrogantly pretend that we are the only ones who can set the agenda. I'm now turning to the poor state of our business, which is the thrust of this webinar. Colleagues, while we can lament the decline and the sad state of our media industry, we need to accept the responsibility and acknowledge the consequences of relying on a defective business model. COVID was a wake-up call, a reminder of the risk of dependence and reliance on narrow revenue streams, and the failure to take advantage of millions of our online audiences. The lesson learned was that while COVID impacted us negatively, it was clear that we are still a trusted source of news, as readers tend to our news sites in search of credible news in the face of fake news. We are still feeling the residual impact of COVID on the economy, despite the business showing some bounce back. Unfortunately, credit agencies and other financial institutions and our own Treasury and Reserve Bank are not optimistic about our economic recovery. Therefore, the media, like any other South African business sector, is not immune to further retrenchments and other effects of a contracting economy. For our business, sustainability will depend on the scale and nature of our innovation, investment, and containment of legacy costs. Unfortunately, we have no rich angles out there, and even philanthropists and donors are under pressure to fund other good competing causes. I'm glad that SANEF is considering engagement with the Competition Commission to look at the anti-competitive behavior of multinational tech companies that are throttling our potential growth in digital revenue. I'm not sure whether the Australian aggressive regulatory approach or a rather collaborative engagement is the way to go, but it's worth a try. This also calls for unity of the sector without being anti-competitive. On the proposals about state subsidy and tax relief proposals, before we consider further engagement with the state regarding subsidy and tax breaks, we also need to be clear about the definition and distinction between public interest journalism and what I call public interesting journalism. Otherwise, it will be difficult to justify the use of public funds for tabloid and other sensational content that is just interesting to the public but add no value to our democracy. And having made this distinction, we must also allow for space for all kinds of journalism to flourish as long as it's practiced within the code of ethics and the law. And we need to be clear on how such funds, if secured, will be insulated to serve the public interest journalism and still ensure independence of editorial decision-making processes. The same concern must be factored in when we consider any corporate social investment in the media and the sustainability fund. The installation will help strengthen the crumbling Chinese wall between editorial and business, even though I personally believe in glass walls and not Chinese walls, given our current circumstances. The glass walls, I mean, where editors are able to see, hear, and sense the poor state of business and take proactive initiatives like you have done thus far. This does not mean in any way that we expect our editors to sell advertising or their soul. Because if they do that, the public will walk away and the media will die a sudden death, and so are the truth and our democracy. And I wish you best of luck. And I wish and I hope that at the end of these discussions, our media and our business and the public at large will be able to restore faith and the trust in the media. I thank you.
Thanks, Mosh. I think one of the points you raised, we really need to get to a little later as well, and I think it links to to the point I'm talking about is the one of what's public interest journalism and what not, you know, and what you called about the insulation of support for that kind of journalism, but how do you actually support the whole journalism industry? And I'm sure we'll get back to that. I also just want to remind everybody, thanks for the very interesting discussion in the chat. When we're done with the panelists, we will ask some people to amplify some of your issues. So Nwabisa, if we can then shift the focus now a little bit on this issue of journalism as a public good. What should be the obligations of public interest journalism, and where does public service media then also fit in that framework? The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Izak, and good morning, everybody. Thank you again to SANEF for this opportunity. Izak, I will perhaps touch on the issues that you raise, you know, a little later. I think I obviously come into this conversation from an editorial perspective, and I think probably share a lot of my colleagues, fellow editors in this country, you know, really what our experiences have been and what we believe should really be sustained as far as, you know, what we're putting forward on the table. So I won't kind of go in on, you know, the state of the media in the country. I think we all understand it, and I think the statutory report especially really kind of lays it bare. But I do think, you know, one of the things for me that have been interesting, you know, as an enduring feature, perhaps in the last many years, is that the more the media industry, the more our business models became slightly outdated, and the more pressure, obviously, we were under, and the more pressure we were under. What was interesting was really kind of the response that we had. Not necessarily, you know, as a collective industry, but just as different entities, you know. And the more pressure we had, we basically began to erode the very things that really made us stand out, the very things that, you know, made us, you know, journalistically to survive previously. And we're talking, you know, matters of quality controls in newsrooms. We're talking, you know, access and reach. We began to cut down and cut back on those things. And importantly, I think we began to cut down on issues of training and development, you know, of journalists. And in my view, perhaps even if it was not necessarily intentional or taken glibly, in my view, it really became a situation where we cut our noses to spite our faces. And I think what the central report, perhaps this moment and the subsequent conference that we're going into with SANEF, it's really an opportunity for us to kind of sit back and take it, and take stock and say, how do we then respond differently to all of these challenges that we are facing at the moment? And I'm hoping that in this regard, these are the things that we're really going to focus on. And I know from a SANEF perspective, it has been said before that one of the interventions, we're putting forward is the establishment of a media sustainability fund. But in my view, I think what is important is really for us to actually understand what exactly are we trying to sustain? What exactly are we wanting to keep going, and why is that? And I think that's where the question of public interest journalism kind of comes into play. That's where the question of journalism as a public good comes into play, as well as public service. And I think if we make, there is obviously a business case, to make, whether to government, whether to corporates, whether to philanthropic organizations, but I think we've probably established that, there is. But I think from an editorial perspective, we perhaps need to really kind of introspect and look at, when we talk about public interest journalism, what exactly are we trying to do? I think Moshe has just said now that it's a distinction that is important, and perhaps will help our cause in whoever we go to say this is what we need to do. And I often ask the question, so one of the burning sort of issues in South Africa at the moment is local government, for example. And essentially, what is the collapse of local government? It's something that all of us feel, in our respective, corners in our communities, etc. Yet, if you look at the media coverage, it is probably one of the issues that has the least attention given to. And this is just an example that I'm making. It's one of the things that has the least attention and that is given to it. It's one of the things that is, is least invested in as far as reporting. And for me, what that really does, or the story that it really tells a story of a disconnect between, what we're trying to do and what we are currently doing as the media, as well as what our audiences would be wanting from us. And you also see, in the event that it's something that we cover, and perhaps cover well, the response to it, and how sometimes it really kind of builds trust between us and our audiences. And I think the point, really, if I were to kind of define public interest, journalism, is really journalism that, Moshe was saying it's not just interesting to the public, but it's journalism that we are absolutely unable to live without as far as the democratic project is concerned. So what are the things that we believe are building blocks to this democracy of ours, things that help us to make decisions about our daily lives, things that make us enable an environment of transparency, whether it's to do with trading, whether it's to do with just simply what we how we try to live, beyond simply just creating conversation, which of course is an important part of journalism itself. And I think one of the things we need to define in crafting whatever policy, and perhaps discussing it here, is really to be frank about the kind of journalism that we've done, to answer the question, what is it that we're doing versus what is it that our audiences are wanting us to do? And the second thing for me, which is quite important, and I think COVID-19 has probably been it was such a blow, in the last couple of years, in the last year, is the issue of access. We talk in the report, which everybody will get after this webinar, in the sustainability report, we talk about the need to create access, particularly on digital platforms. But I think we should go obviously a step further. And access is not just about how many people you have access, but how you access them. So also, in other words, the languages that we use, and South Africa is obviously the nation that it is, with multiple voices, multiple languages. And I think we need to actually look at how we invest in doing that, to be able to really say that we're trying to access as many people as possible. I was quite I found it interesting that I think the central report perhaps mentions essentially that the majority of people in this country have very limited access to the media, but also the media ecosystem. And for me as a journalist, I think what was important in noting that was the fact that, you know, it says even their voices don't find expression in the media. And I think what that does, it really creates these sort of two worlds, you know, so to speak, within, you know, one country. So there are people who obviously can access and have, you know, have their voices and kind of run with them. And there are people who are totally left behind. And there is something for me, you know, from a just a national security point of view, from a national development point of view, that is quite dangerous and concerning when we have those kinds of, you know, worlds, because anything, even in policy making, you then begin to realize that, you know, policies and etc. are made for a particular group of people, and those are the people who are inside the national conversation, if you want to call it that. And then I think the third thing, perhaps, to you know, as a journalist, practicing journalist and editor, when we began to cut out and you know, cut back on things in newsrooms, one of the greatest tragedies I think that we collectively committed was to cut out training and development budgets. And I think what that has done, so essentially we're creating this environment where not only do we have fewer people, many of them younger, totally inexperienced, we thrust them into these spaces where we expect them to compete essentially with these new models of communication that have come forward. And there's absolutely either no training or development at all, or very little. And I think one of the things that we probably need to ask ourselves as far as, you know, the fund and sustainability is concerned, is how do we become more intentional in identifying not only what skills we need currently to be able to do what we need to do, but also how do we answer kind of the national questions, and how do we train people to think critically and be able to, you know, to do journalism that answers, again, you know, what our audiences are wanting from us. And I think that is, we hope in any case that this fund or just the sustainability projects will really at the core of them put the need for training and development of journalists. So we understand, of course, there's a lot of work that is being done. I know from SANEF point of view, there's work being done, you know, in that regard. But I think we probably need to take it further and really ask about, you know, our now as well as our immediate future and our long-term future. What kind of training are we thinking, you know, we ought to do, and how do we identify opportunities for journalists to be able to do that? And perhaps the last thing for me is really about regulatory bodies. We know, for example, that you know, the Press Council, there's a lot of talk about how the Press Council needs to be capacitated. And I think in discussions in that space, you know, are very much about, yes, everybody congratulates us on their ability to self-regulate. And I think we do that quite well. But I think one of the things that we probably need to do as far as bridging the trust gap and the trust deficit between ourselves and, you know, and the audiences is really to capacitate our regulatory bodies and help them to be far more proactive in what we deliver, in what they deliver, than probably currently we are doing. So journalism, you know, as far as public interest, we absolutely need to, I hope that in this conversation, we need to identify and really truly define it, you know, in what it is. And it may differ, and I think we argue that in the report, it may differ even from what we colloquially call as, you know, quality journalism. So we need to absolutely, narrowly define what that is and try and see what kind of a business case are we putting forward as far as that is concerned. Thank you.
Thanks, Nwabisa. It sounds from some of your remarks and earlier inputs as well that the media will really need to get their house in order. And by meaning that is to provide universal access to trusted journalism. And that that we will not be able to actually make the point or make the argument for tax-based support if we cannot show that we really do our best to do so. And I think that is a good way getting into the issue of public service media. To start with that, I want to quote another paragraph from the Windhoek Declaration, which notes that as a public good, information empowers citizens to exercise their fundamental rights, supports gender equality, and allows for participation and trust in democratic governance and sustainable development, leaving no one behind, and that information as a public good is also a key underpinning of effective measures to address global emergencies such as climate and health crisis. And then it goes on. But Phathiswa, so there's clearly an obligation on the SABC to provide universal access to public service content. I wonder if you, in this context, can talk a bit about how public service media can ensure universal access to public services, and of course, it also has implications for languages, and with the SABC as the only organization with the biggest reaching all parts of the country, there's a particular obligation on the SABC to provide universal access to public service journalism.
Good morning, colleagues. To the points that have been made by the previous speakers, I'm not going to repeat some of the stuff that has been said, even though some of it does relate to what I need to deal with. So I'm just going to go to the specifics of the issue of universal access in the context of public service journalism. But one thing that I do want to note, it has come up in all the submissions that have been made, the issue of terminological exactness as to what exactly are we trying to sustain, which is a question I think Anton raised in the chat box. And one other thing that I've also noted is the issue of the social compact between ourselves and the citizens or the audiences that we serve, which seems to be weak, and it's also linked to the relevance of the quality of the journalism that we provide. And one other issue that Nwabisa raised was the point of intentionality, and I think that's a very strong point to raise where our work is concerned. But back to the point that I need to talk to, as far as the SABC is concerned in terms of the public service journalism that we provide, and in the context of the universal access principle that we have to address ourselves to, it is not optional in our case. Yes, public service journalism is about public accountability, that is holding those in power, holding their feet to the fire. And it's also about strengthening of democracy by facilitating citizen dialogue and contributing to human development and progress, which also touches on what you've said in your introduction about the issues of climate change and other aspects of our coverage that are not necessarily coming through strongly in the stuff that we do. So in the context of public service journalism, in practice, universal access is multidimensional and quite elastic. It's about catering to all language and geographical communities through easily accessible channels. And this is underlined by the need for immediacy, relevance, and the utility value of the content that we provide. And so these are the principles that underlie the need for us to provide universal access. But however, in the case of the SABC, this remains largely an ideal due to the funding issues that are publicly known where the SABC is concerned. It is known that the SABC is designated as a public broadcaster, but actually in the way it operates, it's on commercial principles in terms of its business approach, but it delivers its editorial content based on public service broadcasting ethos, which is a paradox because you are designated as one thing, but in the way you operate as something else. And this is evidenced in the way its revenue structure is concerned. So you would have the revenue of the SABC coming from commercial activities constituting more than 80% of what is required. And then you have the licensing part sitting at around 13%. And Then you have the small portion, which is between 2 and 3% as a grant that you get from government. And that actually only serves to deliver educational content, which is part of the public mandate. So if you have an extensive and a heavy public mandate that remains unfunded, despite the demands and the resource strain on the public broadcaster, you are likely to find yourself in some of the cases deciding your coverage on the basis of what is convenient and on the basis of what is affordable, and not necessarily what you are supposed to provide in terms of universal access. So you actually have an elastic universal access requirement. Currently, we provide for the 11 official languages, and then in addition to that, we have indigenous languages like your Klontali and Kwedam that are in the Northern Cape that we cover via XKFM. But then we still have other linguistic communities that we don't touch at all, your Namas and others. So it's not as if there is no need for them to be covered. There is a need for them to be covered, but how do we provide for that when we have limited resources in terms of what needs to be delivered as prescribed in the universal access principle, which is part of our editorial policies? So what becomes clear is that the biggest risk to the public's right to know and free flow of information is not necessarily media freedom infringements or interference, but the lack of funding of public broadcasting, which is what we see on a daily basis. And part of what is raised, I think it's recommendation E about subsidies and the issues around tax. Where the SABC is concerned as a public service broadcaster, this remains a largely political issue. And I do think what Moshoeshoe raised in his input, that this is something that needs to be taken to the public because it's for the benefit of the public and not necessarily what the SABC must do because it feels that this is all it can do. So I do think that there has to be an engagement with the public as to what extent can the financial provisioning of the SABC be extended to the point where the public also gets to make its own contributions that are not necessarily linked to license fees, as is the case now. I mean, licenses, we know that it doesn't matter where you go, they are always seen as grudge payments. And the fact that public service journalism is a public good is indisputable, but the reality is that it is economically inefficient. And hence you hear all these cries all the time. If you are in the space where we operate that, but we're not getting anything from the audiences that you generate because there are also restrictions as to the kind of revenues that can be generated where news content is concerned and current affairs is concerned. But while there are those views that it is economically inefficient, it has a huge social return and a great societal dividend. So that cannot be underestimated because there is a greater role that public service journalism plays in society. And the one point that I also want to make, some of the activities or things that we should consider, and this is not only relating to the SABC, it's stuff that we should be considering as a sector as well, that areas of collaboration should be explored, particularly where community news outlets are concerned. I mean, we could be looking at content sharing arrangements to cover hyperlocal content, like your street level issues that mainstream media or institutional media is not able to access. And those hard to reach communities that at times constitute the voices that are sitting in the periphery of society and require covering, but we're not able to reach. So if we were to work closely with community news outlets, we should be able to do some content exchanges, yes, within defined parameters where we should be able to say they still have to continue with their work, but we can assist in some of the areas, but also meaning that we will benefit from the content that they generate. So this could mean a blend of institutional journalism and collaborative approaches that are premised on facilitating citizen dialogue. The other aspect of collaboration, it could be with other news outlets that are not necessarily in the continuous space. And in this case, while it is possible to do collaboration in that space, there must be clear boundaries where editorial matters are concerned, because we could end up with echo chambers. So there are areas where we could collaborate as the media, but we also need to be clear about the nature of that collaboration and why we are doing it. The issues of professional solidarity, where other news media is concerned, and industry development, where community media is concerned, they need to be dealt with intentionally and encouraged, but within defined parameters. The other point where we deal with provisioning of universal access is about technology. In the context of public service broadcasting and in the context of public service journalism, I usually stay away from using the terminology of digital disruption or anything that's to do with digital developments. I would still prefer to use technological advancements, because the tendency with disruption is to ignore the opportunities that get presented by technological changes. In our case, so where you look at technological advancements and their benefits, they are more about addressing efficient processing and delivery of content and ensuring accessibility of the content to all audiences. What we are not able to do as public service journalists is to monetize public service content. We are not able to do that because you can't put public service journalism behind gated gardens. And you also can't use paywalls to generate content, because it is meant to be accessible to all. So the approach that we take is that we are not television, we are not radio, we are not digital platforms or any other channels. We are news content providers and public service content providers in the way we do our work. And what we see as radio, TV, and digital are the routes that we use to get to the different markets. So we can't be exclusive in some of the areas and close out our audiences to some of our content. So the recommendations as reflected in the document, as I was going through them, overall, the strategy proposals are very sound in the way I see them. But one thing that comes to mind as a red flag is, it is correct to say that all journalism serves a public purpose and therefore must be protected. But when we sit and have this discussion, and I know these are still the initial stages of the discussions that could lead to policy interventions, but one thing that we need to ask ourselves, to what extent are the strategy proposals consistent and aligned with the founding objectives of media owners who are not part of this discussion at this point, versus our intentions as media practitioners? Because it's one thing that we think that these things could be done, but are they consistent with what the media owners seek to achieve with their media entities? And one other thing that we also need to look at is, I read something, and it's been mentioned already, about approaching the Competition Commission and looking at different things that could assist us in achieving some of the initiatives that could assist us in getting to the point where we have a sustainable media. One of the things that come up as a red flag again for me, it's what could end up being strategic coordination in the sector, and what could the Competition Commission read as collusive behavior? Because these are the things that we need to be mindful of. If we talk ethical conduct, it's got to cut across the board. So it can't only apply when it's Tiger Brands and we are safe because we are media. And Moshoeshoe did mention something about exceptionalizing the media, and this could be one area. Do we define ourselves as non-profit entities or as business entities? Do we have profit motives or we are non-profit entities? Because if we are going to go to the different spaces, including the Competition Commission, things like the Media Sustainability Fund could lend themselves in spaces where we are seen as strategically colluding as the media sector in how we do our work. And the other point that we also need to pay attention to is that we need to ensure that we prevent any counterproductive effect that could be to the detriment of diversified media. While we want everyone to exist, we must also bear in mind that it should not be just about quantitative existence. It should be about plurality in the media. So if we say we want media sustainability and we want media that does what society seeks, we should be able to say, with all the strategic interventions that are being proposed, this is what we want to achieve. And back to the question that was raised by Anton, that what is it that we want to sustain? So we need to be clear about that. And also, which is the last concern that needs to be dealt with as well, is that besides competition issues that may arise down the line, we could also be creating an iron cage in the sector where we will inadvertently produce editorial homogeneity that we all sound the same and end up with institutional consensus in the news sector and deprive citizens of the plurality that's required in the media if we are going to support democracy. So that's just one of the areas that we also need to look at as we discuss the strategy proposals overall in terms of media sustainability. And the last point around, I think it's recommendation G and H, about the establishment of a public interest wire service and education and training partnerships. I've dealt with those at the same time. One of the things that got me thinking was the fact that we could look at partnering with research institutes. I mean, these are public research institutes. They are funded by government. It's your medical research councils, your human science research councils, and others that are sector specific in terms of their work. So we could partner with these institutions and actually get access to their research work and their output, which would strengthen our evidence-based reporting. And not only that, we're looking at content, we're also looking at these institutions assisting us in getting training for our journalists and editors where research methods are concerned, because there's also overlap between what researchers do and what journalists do. We all work on case studies, we all work on data, whether it's numerical or textual. But we could also learn some stuff from them in terms of how we read research, how we process research, how we storify that content. I know their writing is usually opaque, but you also want to say to them, in the core dependencies that we are trying to create, it's also making visible the output that the research output that these institutions produce. So I think because they're public institutions, we should be able to come up to some agreement with them, as in accessing the research without having to pay subscription to the different databases where that research is kept. And the last point is on training, also by public institutions like your universities. These are also entities that we should have access to in terms of the training of journalists that takes place there. So instead of relying on internship programs that usually work on defined numbers who can go to media outlets for experiential training, we could actually say where they are sitting. If you have finalist students, let's say in any of the institutions, or you have postgraduate students, instead of them coming to the institutions, which is going to be a limited number, get them to produce content where they are, which is part of their experiential learning. And in that case, you could also argue that you are contributing to skills development in the sector, and you are also ensuring employability of these graduates when they leave the institutions, because they will live with content they've produced for the different entities that they will be assigned to. So there are other ways of making sure that the kind of work that we do is supported by other institutions that are also in the public domain, that also serve the same public interest that we seek to serve as the media. So for me, news media sustainability and ethical conduct are inseparable. And this is a question that has been raised by the previous speakers. And I keep going back to this. If you had the last cent to buy a piece of journalism that would save your life, would you buy what you produce without justification? The same content that you produce, would you spend the last cent that you have to buy the content that you produce without saying, I'm buying it because? And also, if ethical conduct is key to a sustainable news media, how do we improve the trustworthiness and relevance of the news media such that the public trusts what we do? So I'm going to leave it there, Izak, and I'm hoping that the kind of discussions that are going to follow and the different inputs will add to what we have done. But I do think that these interventions are timely. The work that SANEF has done is timely, and we actually need it at this point. It came at the right time. Thank you.
Thank you, Phathiswa. And I think we should note that the work that we're doing now is happening in conjunction with quite a number of international efforts around media and sustainability. The work that Michael referred to earlier, Harry Duckmore's recent report, and there's the information democracy research that they're busy doing on media sustainability. There's a BBC and Luminate research, and there's references to all this in the full report when you look at it. So one of the issues that we have not really touched on, which I again would want to refer back to the World Press Freedom Windhoek Plus 30 declaration, is the issue of the relationship between media and technology platforms and the obligations that may be there to support media with monies or taxation, or in whatever way, as many people say, the social media companies have eaten our breakfast. So 2 paragraphs from the declaration on a call on tech companies. 26, tech companies should support information as a public good in various ways. For example, through fair and inclusive partnership arrangements, which may include donations or other financial measures, and the protection of journalists who are the victims or at risk of online attacks. And so that was one. And then finally, a call on journalists and media outlets to advocate with states and digital platforms as part of their wider protection of freedom of expression and information, to try and get to some kind of arrangement between governments, media, and tech companies to provide some balance between the role of the media, the role of tech companies, and sustainability. So with that, I want to invite comments from the floor. It would be great if anybody wants to amplify some of the issues in the very interesting chat discussion, or if you want to raise new issues. So you can put your hand up by clicking on reactions at the bottom, and there's a raise hand, so raise your hands there. If we ask you to speak, please make sure that both your sound is on and your camera is on. So are there any takers? Anybody would like to comment on anything that you've heard so far? Or, I mean, some of the discussions in the chat's been really interesting. So, Reg Ramney, you first.
Hi, Isaac. Yeah, this looks it's fantastic work being done. What I'm interested in is the next step, as it were, from strategy to tactics. So, how do we engage government other than speaking to the president every now and again? How do we find out what government is prepared to do? Who are the people to actually go to raise these issues? Now, I mean, I've done some work in the economics area, and my feeling is that, you know, some of the people who have the decision-making powers are not listening to these conversations about media. Their heads are somewhere else. So what I'm thinking is we need some kind of tactical thinking about engaging the right people in government. Yeah, that's it. Thanks.
Thanks, Reg. Nwabisa, you next. I don't know whether you also want to touch on what SANEF has been doing in terms of trying to engage government while you're taking the floor.
Sure. So I think Reg is absolutely right. So the question is obviously how, who, other than speaking to the president now and again, who do we engage? So we've been trying to engage since before former, late Minister Jackson Tembu passed away, sadly. There were conversations going on, with him. Obviously, with that having happened, there was then a change. We're trying to speak to, ministers in the presidency as well as communications minister. So there is work kind of going, in that direction. I must say, though, that it's been the response from government sometimes is, as many of you would understand, is quite interesting, because it's almost like you need to speak to this one and then they take you to this person and then they take you to this person. But I will say, though, that there is constant knocking on doors far, below the presidency, as it were, to the people that we think are quite relevant for this conversation. And I think the question really I wanted to ask, maybe not, the question I wanted to ask was, I thought Phathiswa's point was quite interesting about who, not just kind of who, the intentionality, as you say, but what exactly it is that we're trying to save. One of the challenges I think, we have is, yes, we're proposing what is, a media sustainability fund. But I think we actually need to agree on not just how it will work, but whether it will support, there's a part there where it talks about operations in the media entities or particular projects. And I think for me, that's quite an important thing to zoom into as far as, how we think it will work. Because on the one hand, you may have a media entity that kind of does, yes, it does public interest journalism, and it also does other things. So do you then say, well, let's throw in, let's try and support its operations to be able to do what it needs to do, whatever it is that, it does? Or do we say, do we specifically zoom into particular projects as, the variables that we actually need to support? And I think perhaps the discussion here, what I would like to see is hear some views around that as well.
Thanks, Nwabisa. While we're waiting for any takers, more hands to go up, I want to refer you to one of the president's Monday letters, the president's letters that's distributed on Mondays. I think it was around September last year, which really was about the role of journalists in South Africa. And that is actually the only document that I'm aware that's in the public domain, reflecting some of the issues that SANEF has started to raise with the presidency about support for media. So that's the one thing. The other one is there's quite a number of international efforts, some supported by South Africa and some not yet supported, where governments started to commit that they will support media in some or other way. The one is a Declaration on Information Democracy that was South Africa signed, I think, somewhere in 2019, with very clear pointers also how government should, how states should engage technology companies and media to try and find some balance in the operations and existence of the different sectors. But we have not seen the South African government really doing much about that. So one of the things on SANEF's agenda is to try and raise these issues and say that if South Africa commits to international declarations and frameworks and so on, We want to work with them to try and make that happen. So any other takers, anybody who would like to speak, or otherwise we're going to go to the next section where we will focus a little bit more on the recommendations. So Michael, I see your hand is up. So please make your input and then we can dive into some of the details of the recommendations. And I think the production team will at the same time put a poll on that people can give a sense of what they think about the different recommendations. Michael.
Thank you so much, Izak, and possibly if colleagues from Frame Media could just put up, I think it's slide 6, which is the first set of recommendations, and participants can start reflecting on them. But maybe just in response, I saw Anton and I think Nwabisa touched on it as well about ultimately determining what we want to sustain and how we want to define public interest journalism. We deal with that quite extensively in the report, but there was one point I just wanted to reaffirm that was made. But, you know, I think all of these international reports and commissions that have looked into this particular question are maybe rightly abstract in the extent of defining exactly what public interest media constitutes. And it's the Cairncross review that gets closest to fully defining what they envisage or what public interest media is envisaged. And I just want to pull up sort of a general definition that is proposed by Francis Cairncross. And that's simply here. Public interest media is media that ensures community cohesion, the promotion of public accountability, and the enhancement of democratic legitimacy, particularly through investigative and campaign journalism and the reporting on the daily activities of public institutions. Now, I don't suggest that that should be fully adopted as the South African approach, but that's the closest sort of direct reference we see. And complementing earlier speakers today, and what we picked up in some of the interviews was this notion of journalism that seeks to defend and extend constitutional and democratic legitimacy is sort of that ballpark of public interest journalism, which seems to be emerging. So that was the first point. In direct response to Nwabisa, for the sake of debate, you know, we put into this proposals around the fund, this notion of general support funding and project-specific funding. And we had relatively strong pushback. The International Fund, I'll get the direct terminology here, but the International Fund for Public Interest Media has an advisory council which really determines whether or not project-specific funding should be allocated. And some of the submissions we received on preliminary versions of the report, and this maybe goes to a comment that Janet made in the chat about shielding this fund from undue influence, is that to the extent that we allow for excessive discretionary powers on an advisory board or otherwise, as soon as we start assessing the nature of a particular project, we lead ourselves to an area where there may be influence. And the submission that came through and a lot of the comments we received is that the Media Sustainability Fund should focus primarily on general funding and ultimately, but for a public interest inquiry, not seek to understand the direct specifics of a project. So that was maybe just one way to look at the lens. And then in response to Reg and Izak, I know you've been doing some work around this as well. But when we think about the state, I think Chapter 9 institutions, particularly the South African Human Rights Commission, is another potential lever or partner for some of the work that we may want to move forward on and policy proposals that we may want to make. So that was just furthering the debate, Izak. Do you want to open up another round or should I jump straight into some of the recommendations?
I think if we're looking at time, let's get to the recommendations. If you can give an overview, and then we will, once he's done through, we will take the recommendations one by one and ask if there's any comments from anybody. So let's first run through it, and then we can start at the top again.
Perfect, thank you. So, you know, following the structure of the report, we've got these 8 general categories, and we make recommendations under each one of them. And we would really welcome comment here. So if you don't have occasion to study the full report, The recommendations are contained on 2 pages as an annexure at the end of the report. And if you would consider these and maybe provide some additional text or additional suggested recommendations, that would be really helpful to us. But just based broadly on the research and not to too specifically recommend positions, as we're still in the process of considering them, we've come up with a few general recommendations that could be taken forward. Under the Media Sustainability Fund, we ultimately suggest 1, that it is established; 2, that the criteria used to determine the beneficiaries of funding should be mandatory and objective, with limited discretion, if any, to insulate the MSF from political pressure. And then comparatively, we looked at the Multi-Party Democracy Fund, which was recently established in terms of the Political Party Funding Act, as a possible example of how the MSF could operate. And here, people who would want to contribute to the media could contribute to this fund, and it would similarly shield donors from undue influence, as with the Multi-Party Democracy Fund, and that all funding would be channeled into the MSF and then distributed by the MSF, that donors wouldn't have influence over where that money went. Then we turn to access to public interest news. Here, B1 is directly replicated from Harry Dugmore's recent research. And we just suggest here that data provision in terms of levels of access, standards, and quality needs to be seen as part of the social infrastructure, which is in the digital era as important to people's well-being as access to electricity and other services. And I think, Terry, that was your opening comment in the chat earlier today. B2, we suggest that further research and greater public debate about zero rating should be a major project for the SABC and SANEF to ensure a fair balance between for-profit and public interest media organizations, and for a fair balance between rural and local news provision. We can then turn over to the next slide. In terms of fostering competition in the digital economy, again relying on a proposal that Harry made, we suggest that the South African government should work closely with countries in SADC and other regional economic communities and the AU to investigate an Africa-wide approach to multinational platform power. That may be in addition to a South African specific approach. We suggest that SANEF and other organizations should consider working more directly with the South African government and with FANGs and other platforms to explore much larger scale support for public interest journalism. By FANGs, we refer to Facebook, Amazon, Apple, Netflix, and Google. And here we suggest, there is now comparative examples coming out of Australia and France, and these may be conversations that need to develop. We then also suggest that to the extent that the Competition Commission engages in a market inquiry, and obviously cognizant of the fact not to engage in anti-competitive behavior, but solely for the purpose of making a submission, SANEF may want to partner with interested parties should this market inquiry into the digital economy develop. Media Monitoring Africa made a submission last year to the competition inquiry to this effect, but it wasn't considered. The role of the media in the digital economy wasn't expressly considered, and there may need to be a more widespread submission on that particular point. So we make that the proposed recommendation C3. Then D1, 2, 3, and 4, we suggest that the South African government should consider amending tax laws to enforce a fairer taxation of profits that are made from local advertising, in particular, including the possible introduction of special transactions levies. We suggest that the South African government should consider converting license fees to bespoke taxes collected by competent tax authorities. This is pulled from Harry's COVID-19 research. 3, we suggest that tax relief on public interest media organizations in the form of value-added tax exemptions and reductions in pay-as-you-earn taxation should be considered by SARS. And then lastly, here we pull a comparative example. I think it links to some degree with the discussion that Anton and others were having about the French couponing system. But the US Local Journalism Sustainability Act has a similar provision where any spend on subscriptions on public interest media organizations is then reimbursable. And we suggest here that we could possibly look at amendments to the Income Tax Act, which would allow tax deductions for businesses, donors, and individuals who support local journalism through subscriptions. So that's really the tax relief schemes. There's 2 more slides to go through. If I could just ask colleagues to go to 3 or 4. In terms of subsidies, and here, Janet made a good point, and we may want to add an extra recommendation proposing a full evaluation of the work of the MDDA, or at least a SANEF-supported evaluation. But we suggest that direct and indirect media subsidies, in addition to state subsidies, should be considered by the government in partnership with the private sector. These subsidies should seek to promote and facilitate the production and dissemination of quality news. Here, again, referencing work by, I think, Reg and Harry, that all bureaucratic obstacles in the concessionary license application process should be removed by the SABC, and this relates to concessions on TV licenses. We suggest that public interest media organizations may want to consider, if they are adopting, implementing paywalls, access tiering to ensure that broader access is enabled behind paywalls. And I think Hassan made this point in the quote as well, indicating that we have grave disparities in access and we have a widening digital divide. And if paywalls are going to be one of the strategies adopted going forward, access tiering, particularly for students, social grant recipients, and the elderly, may be.
Are you also in this?
And then we have, fourthly, MSF, or another funding mechanism, should support media innovation and sustainability. There was a comment about fostering new business in the chat, and we list a couple of examples that could be considered there. Then in terms of coupon and open access systems, SANEF and other organizations should consider exploring not-for-profit and social enterprise models, which enable and facilitate media sustainability, socially conscious business practices, and corporate social investment in public interest media. We can then turn to the last slide. That'd be 404. In terms of the public interest wire service, we suggest that further research could take place in this regard. I would really welcome views from participants, if there are any, about this idea in general terms, but equally if we should consider further research in developing this particular idea. And then lastly, in terms of education, training, and learnerships, we suggest that fellowships, learnerships, and internships should be partly funded by the MSF. We also suggest that funding should be made available by this Media Sustainability Fund to mid-career and senior journalists. And then we note as an urgent priority that the South African government should establish adequately funded financing instruments for independent MIL initiatives. And we pulled that recommendation out of a recent Council of Europe set of recommendations on media sustainability. So that in a nutshell are the preliminary recommendations that we drawn from this research. We would really welcome additional recommendations, views on the current status quo of those recommendations, or equally recommendations that we shouldn't proceed with going forward.
Thanks, Michael. So that was a very quick overview. I want us to now just go back. If we can put the slide back with recommendation A on, and then we'll just go through the recommendations and hear if there's any comments or questions or issues, and we try to just deal with that. And what we're also interested in, of course, is if somebody is vehemently opposed to something, please say so and why. If not, we assume that you're fully supportive. Okay, so can we get that slide back, please? The first recommendation, which is about the Media Sustainability Fund. And while we're getting that, just in response to one of the comments. So what we want to do is to go to the conference to get an in-principle decision on the establishment of a Media Sustainability Fund. In the report that we will distribute to people with, to SANEF members and those who ask for it, there's also an annexure with a bit more information on how this fund could be managed or administered. But one of the key issues will be on the question of who could benefit from it. The very first one would be adherence to an industry ethics code. And we're really talking here about the press code, the BCCSA code, and so. So that would be definitely one of the key criteria, and then there may be others as we go through that. So are there any comments or questions about recommendation A on the Media Sustainability Fund?
So can I just add, and I appreciate that people are going to want time to digest a lot of these recommendations, but I see that Kate's put some text in the chat, and that may be another way for participants just to add potential recommendations or insights as well.
So if there's nothing else on A, on B, on access to public internet news websites and the idea of zero rating of, I would say, at the least content which is not behind paywalls, or maybe all or most of that content. Any suggestions around that? So Hopewell, you say in the chat, silence does not mean consent. So I want to say, please raise your voice if you disagree. Otherwise, we will take silence as support. So Hopewell, what do you disagree with?
No, Izak, I was just poking at you.
Thank you. Right, let's go to the next slide. C.
Comrade Izak, sorry.
Yes? Who was that?
I tried to raise my. It's Wara.
Wara, please go ahead.
I'm looking at. I think I've. First, my apologies for being very. I think I'm very late, and sometimes you end up catching things halfway, things which might have been already discussed. And I was like trying to look at recommendation 1.
Yeah.
And it's quite interesting because if we look at the actual mainstream, the idea of the fund, which is, I think, is a brilliant idea, you know, and I just want to look at maybe on how will it function, because if you look at the companies basically holding the sector intact, I mean, are all listed companies which are making millions and millions and millions, and most of them, even during Corona, have been very, very profitable in essence. And if you look at NASPAS in Media 24, if you look at Arena, Truly Bashe, you know, these are huge companies. And if you look at the Kexting Group, and you know, these are huge companies that are actually, yes, there are companies that are suffering, like the Million Guardian and others, you know. So I want to look, how will this fund operate? You know, have been these corporates been engaged? Because for me, personally, coming from the sector, the community media sector, which is marginally has always been on the periphery of the industry itself, you know, and it is the same companies that to me interest me, because for me there seems to be no separation. Maybe I'm wrong, might be guided here. There seems to be no separation for me from the newsroom and journalism itself to these holding companies, you know, and how, because I think we should be actually confronting these companies, you know, for them to play their due diligence in terms of demonopolizing the industry. Their mandate was clear in 1999 that they have to contribute and put input into the direction, into the money, into MTTA, so that a transformation of the industry and a continuation of grooming and making journalism out there, you know, and they have not lived up to that. They have not lived up to that at all. They pulled out of the MTTA, and around about 2010, 2009, most of them, and due to circumstances that we still don't even know today, that were never clarified.
Yeah.
One sentence, one more sentence, Izak. And to add to that, okay. Maybe I'm taking it too far, I don't know. But I was just going to say that to add to that, the industry itself, we had print media South Africa, which was a uniting factor around the industry. And now we have independent, which is on the periphery running its own horse. And then we have others on the side, who are not even, and for me, I think there's no consideration in actually, if we have to look at the problem in the whole industry, we have to look in essence at what is actually happening. We first need the unity of the industry itself. We have to bring back independent. We have to bring community media together. We have to bring everyone to the table so that we can be able to have a good formulation that can lead us into the right direction. I'm not sure if maybe
Thanks, Vara. So let me
making
try
something
and give you an answer on this. Firstly, I think we cannot wait for all the problems in the media to be fixed before we move. So we need to start working on different initiatives. So one of those would be the establishment of such a fund. The first step would be to get an in-principle agreement before we even go to exactly who will it support and who not. But having said that, in the report that you'll get, that you can, and we would really appreciate your detailed input on that, you will see that there's some policy choices and options about what kind of activities should such a fund fund in support of the media industries. Should it, for instance, be focused on non-profit media, on bodies like the Press Council and so on who would support media, on bettering training and investigative journalism, on funding the type of content that no one does or can afford, or where there's too little of. I'm thinking, for instance, about issues around science and climate change and things like that. So, but these things we're not there yet to say this will be, this is what should be covered or not. We hope that once we have an in-principle decision at the conference, that we can start with the detailed work on that. In the meantime, I would really call on everybody, when you get the report, we would love to have your ideas to see how we can strengthen the recommendations and also fill in any gaps and reflect. I mean, in the end, the reason for this session is to get as many views as possible to strengthen the report before we table it formally at the conference. Right, so we're back to C. Any questions or issues? Hassan, I see your hand is up. Hassan Lorhat, I see your hand. Do you want to speak?
Hi, Izak.
Yes.
It's Hassan Lorgat, yeah. I think one of the things we must consider is getting more non-commercial and non-state media activists involved in the conversation, or critical media consumers as part of it. I have of recent times used both the BCCSA as well as the Press Council more recently. And I see there are different tests for citizens to actually complain. In the Press Council, one needs to show a very direct relation to the story. Let's say if you are affected or impacted upon by racism, you got to show that it is you, not that you can feel for how other human beings are portrayed. So, for example, the BCCA will then ask that the organization that is directly implicated in the story must raise a complaint. This is not the same requirement for the BCCSA. The Press Council will do that, by the way. So sorry, just to clear that out. So the Press Council wants to be very formal and legalistic to see, are you the direct person impacted upon? Now, I think these inconsistencies actually reveal a constitutional failure on the part of the Press Council. I've told them that, and we'll be taking it up later. And also I've raised the issue here about whether us who've worked in trade unions and others spheres would actually be covered by such a fund, and the discussion continues in the group. Thanks.
Thanks, Alison. Just a brief response to that. This is exactly the reason why SANEF supports current efforts by the Press Council to argue for some kind of umbrella or an umbrella code, so that we don't confuse the public about, if they want to complain, that there's one code that will cover all platforms. But thanks for your input on that. So any other input on C or D? Either fostering competition or tax relief and others. Michael Aldrich.
Yes, I'd just like to know whether you have any definition of public interest media, which would then guide who would get funding from a media sustainability fund. And also then just to suggest that possibly this, there could be a more pointed or kind of funding perhaps for investigative journalism, rather than this sort of, I don't know, it seems like quite a woody concept of what is or is not public interest. I mean, one can say the SABC is a public interest media, or community media is public interest media, but then that would leave out commercial media. So, I mean, investigative journalism is something which can occur across media, but then obviously we need good investigative journalism rather than shoddy investigative journalism, which is something that we've seen from some publications in the past. So I would say, either you need to define public interest media very specifically, or as I say, direct it to something very specific like investigative journalism. Thanks.
Thanks, Michael. So in the report, when you read it, you will see that there are efforts to look at definitions of public interest journalism from different countries and different bodies. And you're right that this is one of the key things that we will need to do is to properly define that, because that definition will then be a key definition alongside adhering to industry codes of how the funding should be managed. So again, we invite people to please, let's have your views on it when you respond to the report. Anthea Garman.
Thanks, Izak. I had a thought, so it's not exactly a direct response to the recommendations, but I had a thought just watching what was taking place in the chat, the conversation that is about, the media owners, particularly, independent under Tony O'Reilly, kind of asset stripping, in order to benefit industries, other parts of the world. I think there might need to be some kind of defense and investigation of how media owners in the private media have operated in South Africa. It was one thing to kind of put the MDDA and other sort of entities like that under the spotlight as to their functioning. But in fact, it's not much of a defense for the private media when one looks at the way the owners of these media companies have operated to undermine public interest journalism. So, while the profits flow, and then when things get tight, they often, those entities inside their own media organizations get thrown under the bus. So I'm wondering if, just a little bit of thought about how those owners of private media have operated in this country, you know, some history and some knowledge of that, but also maybe it requires of us to have some kind of, I don't know, code of conduct, some obligations if you're in the business. So you're not just in the business of media. If you're in the business of media, which includes public interest media, there are particular kinds of obligations on you so that you can't asset strip the very resources that keeps this media functioning. And I think that's a little bit of the looking back inside into the house, you know, instead of just considering it all a very large crisis. So I just think there's going to need to be, particularly when we, you know, get to the point of actually taking this into conversation with government, there's going to have to be a defense or a deep knowledge of that, or some way of accounting for and putting in place protections. Because what if we have the best case scenario, we revive, you know, news journalism across our country and across all our platforms? How absolutely flippin' marvelous. What's to stop another shark stepping in and thinking, oh my gosh, this is a lovely arena for me to play in with my shareholders? So I think we've got to have some kind of consciousness about that. Thank you.
Thanks, Anthea. Very right. Can we go to the next slide, please? So on the subsidization and the coupon recommendations. And I think let's just take the last slide as well, because we're rapidly running out of time. Any on the wire service, education, training, any further comments? Okay, so I think let's then wrap it. So just to recap then, it seems like there's general support for the recommendations, and thanks for the very useful input. So thanks for joining us in this conversation. Special mention goes out to APSA, the Wraith Foundation, and the Social Justice Initiative, as well as the team from frayintermedia. And thank you for joining us, and goodbye. See you at the conference.